Hello, Maclemaniacs. It's Dr. McAvoy here. It's not my real name. I suppose it was that, or I know. Terry Clicks, something like that. Anyway, will Maclemaniacs catch on? I don't think so. But use it if you want to. All right. So look, we're here to talk about our old friend James Bond. Why? Well, because we can, and because the Times wrote an article on Monday, the 2nd of September, saying, "Where's Bond gone?" Which, funnily enough, was a question on my mind. Perhaps it was on yours. By the way, before we carry on, I'm on location for this video. I'm not in my usual dwelling. So consequently, there's going to be none of the high production values you're accustomed to, none of the world-class editing, none of the prosumer visual effects that add millions and millions of pounds of production value to what would otherwise just be a man talking into his iPhone. So, please make allowances for this. So, look, James Bond. What happened to James Bond? You heard from him recently? I haven't. Because he's not been around a very long time, has he? And there's a reason for that. The reason is that Amazon bought MGM. And when they did, they put the whole James Bond franchise into development hell. A think tank of Amazon's greatest creative minds gathered to discover what should they do with this thing that they've paid, $10 billion for. Much like the Disney Brain Trust that thought about Star Wars and said, well, I know what we could do. We could remake the original movie. So don't be surprised if, indeed, you get remakes of all the Bond films. But of course, it won't be. They'll have the same titles, but they won't be the same movies. There'll be adaptations of Ian Fleming's novels, probably period adaptations of those novels. But we'll come back to that. There's been a long hiatus, hasn't there? If you're a fan of James Bond, Die Another Day was released in 2021. It had been made 2 years earlier. So in fact, it's been about 6 years since cameras rolled on a James Bond movie. It's a very, very long time. And that delay has been, the previous delay between Bond movies was all about getting Daniel Craig on board and, raising all that sponsorship money and trying to work out what to do in that kind of slapdash, ad hoc, make it up as we go along fashion that Eon and the Broccoli's and all of those people have been adopting since, 1962. And occasionally it's resulted in very good James Bond movies. And occasionally it's resulted in bafflingly bad James Bond movies. Poor old Roger Moore, who we love. I love Roger Moore, don't get me wrong. He's wonderful. But his Bond films were subservient to whatever trend was prevalent in the day in the cinema. Live and Let Die's blaxploitation, Man with the Golden Guns got Kung Fu in it for no reason other than Kung Fu was very popular in the mid-70s. You've got Moonraker, of course, which was hoping to capitalise on Star Wars' popularity, and so on. There's barely room for any real bondage. So Amazon are plotting to resurrect James Bond. I say plotting in that sort of Machiavellian way because, of course, whatever they do is bound to be terrible. The analogy used in the Times article was that they're building the house, and the very last thing you do is you hang the curtains. Hanging the curtains in this case means hiring a new James Bond. So they're working out what to do for the next few movies, and they're trying to come up with what they call a concept, right? A concept. What does that mean? It means what's the frame for the new Bond movies? What are they going to do? Are they going to start again? Are they going to go back to the 1960s? Are they going to be contemporaneous? If they are, are they going to follow on from Craig's little bubble of Bond movies? In which case, how do you explain his death? The last brainwave they had in the post 9/11 era, after the debacle of Pierce Brosnan, was to go serious, go introspective, go deep. Daniel Craig's Bond movie was Bond series, if you like, was an attempt to make James Bond a real person. Oh, it can't just be a heightened figure anymore. It can't just be, a receptacle for idealized male traits like virility and charisma and being handsome and well traveled and all the rest of it, and be all gadgety. And so no, got to make James Bond a real man, give him an interior life. In previous Bond movies, they skirted around this, didn't they? Occasionally they threw a little nugget at us. Timothy Dalton flirted with real-world emotion and feeling and interiority, but he never let it get in the way of the bread and butter stuff that made James Bond James Bond. And the closest Roger Moore came was kneeling at, his wife's grave at the start of For Your Eyes Only. And, you don't need me to tell you what happened next, but it was what we call a film crime, which should, hopefully one day will be prosecuted in the Film Crimes Court in The Hague. John Glenn, if you're watching this, go to a country with a non-extradition treaty and hide there if you value your liberty. A mistake was made when trying to reset the James Bond era, a short-sighted mistake. Adapting Casino Royale was a good idea for the Daniel Craig era. But the mistake in terms of the movie series was to literally make this James Bond's first adventure. It didn't make any internal sense continuity-wise anyway, because they retained Judi Dench's M. But, which was odd. I hope you agree. But the real mistake was to give James Bond a real-world life cycle. In previous James Bond movies, the actor changed and the series carried on, and we let it go. We didn't blink an eye. We said, okay, yeah. Timothy Dalton is the same man as George Lazenby, Roger Moore, it's the same man as George Lazenby and Sean Connery. They just kept, they didn't explain it. They just kept going. You suspended your disbelief and you went on. But the post 9/11 trend was for gritty realism, for naturalism. So they felt that they had to explain everything. Everything had to fit into the real world. So Daniel Craig's James Bond is not like previous James Bonds. He's got psychological problems. He's got PTSD. He's a lonely man trying to cope with his life. As he gets older, he starts to get a bit more rickety, and then he retires, and then, disastrously, he dies. End of cycle. That's no fucking good if you're a James Bond fan. You don't want James Bond to die. James Bond has to live. James Bond has to carry on. Because there's always a fucking megalomaniac around the corner who wants to flood the world, isn't there? So by making Daniel Craig's James Bond a real person, it meant that his movies represent their own self-contained series. And when that series is over, as it now thankfully is, after frankly, you know, a lot of movies with a lot of chin stroking and 1,000-yard stares and all the rest of it, then, and very little, you know, humour or in the case of Spectre, action, you end up going down a creative cul-de-sac. There's nowhere else to go. What do you do after you've killed James Bond? Somebody in this, some fan group person in this Times article said, well, you know, they can't kill James Bond twice. I wouldn't have killed him because killing him destroys any sense of jeopardy. Bollocks. He's a cartoon character. We don't expect him to be in any real danger of dying. You don't watch a James Bond movie thinking, oh, is he gonna die? You know he's not gonna die. The fun is watching him escape death. So when James Bond was rained down upon by Japanese missiles and killed in Die Another Day, it created this really, you know, ridiculous full stop on what should be a sort of eternal character. And the movie lumbered him with a girlfriend and a child. James Bond does not have a girlfriend and he doesn't have a child. Bollocks. No. Ridiculous. James Bond is not like you and I. He is escapism personified. And that is what makes James Bond work. You know it, I know it. So what do they do, you know, if they bring him back? Well, if it were me, I would just carry on and ignore the death. But I know that Amazon, you know, I'd have a new man and we'd forget about it, not mention it, not talk about it. But if the studio, if Amazon insisted we did have to talk about it, if we had to come up with a concept, as they say, upon which to hang this new set of movies, well, there's been lots of ideas about this over the years. You may recall years and years ago they were talking about making James Bond a code name, which would give a real-world explanation as to why he's known everywhere. You know, everybody, all the villains know who he is, all the bartenders know who he is, you know who he is, your dog knows who he is. He's the least secret agent in the history of the world. Would that matter so much if we establish that James Bond was just his name, you know, the name assigned to whoever 007 is? They've all got their names. You know, 003 is always Harry Rothschild, for example. And that the latest man, having reached that level, is promoted to 00 status, becomes 007, becomes the new James Bond. Now, I know I can feel your spine contracting and your balls retracting. I understand that you hate this idea. I do, I get it. I don't like it much either. But you've got to square the circle of how James Bond can die. Something happened, right? If you're going to carry on and it's not going to be a full reset of the series, you have to explain it. If the movies are going to continue to be set in the present day and feature multi-million-dollar product placement, then you have to explain it. Now, Amazon don't need to do what MGM used to do and haul the movie out to 4,000 commercial sponsors because they have got money. So they could decide to not do that and set the James Bond series in the 60s again. And that'd be fine, wouldn't it, for a few movies? But then what do? Do you then move on into the 70s, the 80s, the 90s? Do we go through the whole cycle again with a different set of movies? Is that desirable? What do you think? I don't know. Of course, I'd like to see some glossy, big budget period James Bond movies. I think that would be fun. I don't know, but again, it's just kind of limiting, isn't it? It buys you time. But the only way to keep a series like the James Bond relevant is for it to be, as Cubby Broccoli used to say, set it 5 minutes into the future. You know, you want to see James Bond dealing with the world as it is, don't you? Unless you're one of those sort of nostalgic people who preferred it, you know, back in the old days. But the 60s and 70s and the 80s and the 90s, and James Bond was at its sort of, well, not the 90s, but, you know, when James Bond was James Bond, those movies were interesting and exciting and relevant to audiences because they were set in the present day, not in the past. It was the threat to the world now that made them relevant. Does it matter if someone's trying to destroy the world in 1964? We know they won't succeed in 2024, don't we? You know. Should James Bond become a museum piece, a period piece? I don't know. Personally, I have my doubts. Adapting Ian Fleming's novels, as they were written, would be, again, really interesting. But maybe that should be a side series. I mean, the other thing that Amazon could do is diversify the James Bond series. You could have James Bond Classic. If you establish it's a code name, you could have James Bond Classic and James Bond Contemporary, for example. Fuck it, why not? You know, you had show the adventures of the old James Bond and the current James Bond. If it's a code name, you can do that. You could have movies featuring the other 00s. It's been talked about many, many times over the years. But, you know, what does 001, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, and 9 get up to when they're not at home? Well, why don't we find out? But, you know, I know what you're thinking. That sounds a bit dangerous. It sounds a bit like the James Bond cinematic universe, and we've had enough of those, haven't we? So, you know, maybe that's a terrible idea. But if you're an Amazon executive and you're already making a note of that idea, well, feel free, but contact me because I'll be expecting my cut. Rumour has it, according to the Times, that they're trying to find a series of highly pliable directors to helm the next movies. That's a very worrying trend, like the guy who directed the latest version of All Quiet on the Western Front, for example. Do we want pliable directors helming James Bond movies? Is that a good idea? Don't we want people who have vision and clout and actually are filmmakers with real skill? I'm not saying that, you know, lowly indie directors aren't skilled, but how do they fare with these big franchise tentpoles? I mean, look at Lucasfilm and the way that they've taken all of these obscure indie directors, you know, who've never done a fucking thing in genre or blockbuster filmmaking, and suddenly they get promoted, or if you like, demoted to blockbuster status. Here you go, Hans Lebing. We love that movie you did about, you know, the potato famine in Ireland and that wonderful thing. What was it called? Dewdrops on a Tree. Wonderful, wonderful film. I loved all 17 hours of it. It was beautiful. Do you want to make a James Bond movie? All the action's been prevised, by the way. All we need you to do is just do the drop-in human interaction scenes. Just make them low-key and kind of naturalistic. Is that what we want? Do we want directors who actually have style and personality? And yes, a bit of heft so they can push back. And they've got their list of, you know, studio notes. And really? This is it? The checklist of scene? You know, you want someone who's going to bring their own thing to it. Or Danny Boyle failed, didn't he? Because he had some ideas for No Time to Die, as it became, and that was a bit fruity for the Broccoli's. So, where does that leave James Bond? It leaves it, on the boil. They're plotting right now, what to do with it and who to do it with. And I'm not so fussed about the casting. I'm sure they'll cast somebody who's suitable, energetic, charismatic, handsome, probably about 35 years old. That'll be fine. But what kind of Bond movie will that man be helming? And who will be helming it? And what type of concept will it represent? Because they're not planning for single movies anymore. They're planning for the next 2, the next 3. I don't know the fucking answer, but I'll go and see it when it comes out. It will give me something to make a video about. But, please, if you're watching Eon, Amazon, for God's sake, do get it right. Do look after it, as Q would say. Till next time, I'm Dr. McAvoy. That's not a code name. Shaken, not stirred. Goodbye.